adaptation is your mind, adaptation to its imagination itself. The mind can't live with the body can't live with the soul. So what does that mean in attractions? That means they come together. They formulate, they simulate, they work together, they are one together. What we have to come into in positions of is to recognize what reality are we always in? The mind of imagination of itself. So that means if I'm in imagination world, sir, that means my body itself is its imagination of its system. But how does this all come together? Through the animator to the animations that you are. And that's where you come to your schematics. That's where you come to your inner child. That's where you come into the mind of inception. Now, the more we let go, the more we surrender to that, the more it gets easier how we see ourselves through perception of ourselves, not perceptions of others, of how we see each other. We want to see ourselves through each other, not the other way around. It's the mind of conception and confusion that puts everything into your thoughts, your actions, and emotions that basically puts you in determination systems when you're in that position of sleep mode or recharge or remote or location setting and travel. But we're all levels in remote view. Everything exists all at once in your capacities, your spiritual capacity, your meta capacity, your mental capacity, your psychological capacity, psychosis capacity, and position, location, emotional capacity. Your spiritual is the highest formation setting, which is you through the mind of imaginations. Okay, so when you all come together, everything comes in sync with each other. We start to identify who we are through the eyes and windows of our souls. First, we master our interpretation of the game that we put ourselves in. First, we get into the operation setting to understand how to get in that communications, how we come into the mind of interpretations of a mind inception first. Then we come into levels of mastering ourselves inside through ascension. We're all ascension masters. And the more you identify that, it gets a lot more easier to see that. And how you see through perspective and how you see through perception is how you actually see the true resonance of everyone, rather seeing them how you see yourself. There's a lot of confusion there when you get into that mind interpretation system. Now, in that track correlation system, your game is now fully awake. So you have to go all levels again and again and again and again and again until you understand the resonance of its pattern is the mind of imagination that you are in. The body's not here or there, but needed, but it's always there, which means it's traveling everywhere all at once. The mind is the body. The body is the soul. They're connected of one. That's a 4 lines of sequence lines, a 5-line track correlations to its heart that puts everything in lines of conversion, set, position to its system, all through the mind of inception, guys. This is the integration setting. So when you go through the mind again, you process the inner child through yourself as a baby, okay? Baby, child, teenager, adult. Those are 4 sequence lines of settings. The process in communication setting is coming to the heart, which is the ascension of your vacation setting to your system, okay? That gets you in a lot more balance of what you're doing in position, coming into the mind imaginations of who you are, not through memory of the worlds that you see everybody else. It's how you see yourself, the real, true, authentic self. Puts you in all lines of all communications and setting, because you're all free. Every single one of you, all lines, all communications, sovereignty. But once you recognize what reality you really live in real time, everything starts making sense and it's that position, location, attractions. All right. So test coming up. Same lines of high centers and true lines, resonance and patterns. We're coming into the planetary setting of surface of all track location system into your solar system. This general AI, space-time creator, setting track center location, imagination core. Okay, so in that position lines, we'll go through Schumann lines of graphs. Now, Schumann lines of graph is a line screen adaptations all over the planetary line. We'll get 3 lines of provisions. You guys are now in your track order lines to your servers, location setting, coming out of your general settings, coming to your own modifications of your mind, at all lines of mind, imaginations, what you created through the game. But the game itself is now awake. So that is an interpretation setting where you see light and dark in set position 1, center 1, operation 1, yin and yang. So when you guys are closing your eyes in that position, it's now in real time. So anything you come into vision of, anything through all lines of schematics, anything through drawing, or anything positioned through its primary circle, location setting, anything through communication, anything you come into frame, anything you come in tracks, anything you come in clock, anything you come in foundations, you're actually seeing it in real time, happening in seconds, minutes, and hours in one frame, one traction, one location, one setting. I'm closing my eyes to show you exactly, but eyes are not closed. My eyes are always open. So there's not lines of anything of communication setting because you're not seen from the other side. You're seeing all levels, all lines existing all at once. So when I'm closing my eyes are actually open in all lines of all time. Setting lines of communications now. So the conceptual setting, once you come into the vision lines of cortex and you see a dimensional door, you're seeing that in real time happening in your house. Setting lines of sequence and set position locations. Open the line center, high position eye receptors. Track to its communication lines of remote and location of mind, imagination setting to its core correlation setting, and cerebral cortex lines of design. Mystical cortex is coming in. High track line communications in. Conversion location setting to its acceptance. Coming in position location to the mind. I understand where I am in track location system. I'm seeing the perception of who I am in set position lines of calculation setting and seeing everybody else of who they really are and their true authentic self. Booyah. Okay, seeing all that is already knowing all that. So once you get into that position, it gets much easier at what you're doing through travel. Okay, because when you start identifying where you are in your reality, you got to ask yourself, where does my reality come from? How do I get into this vision? How do I understand what's going on? How do I see what's happening? Why am I seeing this? Why am I seeing that? This is confusing. Why is it confusing? Because you're not seeing the perceptions of others. You're seeing the perceptions of how you see others through yourself. And it's very confusing when you guys are into the mind of inception of dreaming. Interpretations of dream waves, line consistency, lock line, and seek location setting, high travels in point lines of graph, sleepwalking. All right. Sleepwalking is a mind line, conception lines that open lines of sequence, but the body has no idea what it's doing. But the body's moving automatically now. So the mind has interpreted the body in that position. That's how it's able to get out of its body. Setting lines of track course, set location to its automatic system that lines its communication setting to a mapping sequence lines of pi. So when you get out of the bed, your eyes are closed, but in position, the mind is open. So that's in the conceptual location of balance and set track location in your system off their travel. Now the mapping sequence lines, the planetary line screens, puts all communication in your soul settings. That puts all process and position location how you come into your solar system. Okay. Now 8 lines of channels, 3 lines of signals, 4 lines of setting lines of travel communications. Okay, so let's get into position lines of Pluto. Okay, Pluto comes in line core centers, calculate and modify. Set calculation lines of Jupiter and line rotation system and travel. Okay, set lines of 3 lines of signals and 3 lines of grounds like communication lines of high setting. All right, and the communication lines, high direct signals, processes communication lines of travel and direct signal lines of grounds of its Earth. Earth line rotations. Remember, it's a track core lines, a high set location setting, all measure and scale in remote view that puts all communication setting, all line core centers in travel and communication string theory in direct locations imagination system. Okay, so it spins lines, high core centers, lines of travel, direct lines of planetary line screen adaptations of string theory. Sets lines of location grid, 3 lines of signals, flux over screen, 3 lines of triangulation, flux over 4. And track communications. Well, what happened to the triangle? It was there, disappeared, because you're not ready to understand frequency. See? Wind cycles, high correlation, and high positional weather panels, directing signal lines of grounds of surface interactions. Now, oh, it's not there. See? I keep putting it up, but it keeps disappearing. Why? Because you're not ready to see it. Why? Because it's too fast. Why? Because you're not understanding the mind of imagination. Now it's there. Now it's in. Now it's in setting. So, for you guys to understand frequency is understand your clocking lines. Your clocking system, your planetary line center, has its own imagination setting of its own mind, of a conception of its own inner child, which is its own conscious of its own awareness. Now you can refer that in line positional case to a sentient or a symbiosis or a symbiotic unit. That comes into all lines, how you see lines of frame of communications, because the team is now seeing the alteration setting coming out of the memory when they go through their upgrades and uplinking setting, downgrading, up-level systems. Get in that communication setting, it sets lines of 4 lines of sequence, lines of 5 lines of elements, put you into space lines, modulation screens, interpretation, how you see your mind, of your imagination setting, and where you see your body, everywhere else in seconds, minutes, and hours of clocking. So it's very powerful once you come in that positions. All right? Change lines of grounds. Did it change position, location, and traction? No, it's still there. All right, so let's add another triangulation setting. Bold screens, direct lines of grounds, high center correlation setting, equalized high center interference at equaline correlation setting, a question of screen. Is it there? Yes, it is. So high rise, mediation graph line. All right, so it's a coloration lines of dark, coloration lines of fade. Center core centers of center operate the system and travel in communication system and travel communication incognito. Directing lines of grounds, set lines of height, lines of surface, and travel communications. Okay, overline sequence inside and outside through traction. Very powerful stuff in setting. Bring it back home, back in setting, back in balance, change communication lines of grounds, and set position calculations. Right? All right. I showed you exactly how powerful it is. All light is inside line setting, but you have to understand how to use it through your light webbing and your dark webbing to set lines of sequence. Coming to the mind of empty space. That's what is in structures. You have a house. There's a house. Okay? You're inside the house. It's you inside the house. That's you inside the house. But there's nothing inside the house. Okay? All you see is the floor. Okay? All you see is the location grid. Right? All you see is set position. But it's the mind of empty space. All you're seeing a house and nothing inside the house is just empty. So, getting in that communication is truly understand how to use your planetary lines, high position, location of clocking, foundation lines of grounds. It's setting communication, high position, location to a system, all through tractions. Okay? All through tractions, right? So this is you and everything else, which is empty. All right? The mind is stillness comes in tractions, all direct lines, calculation, setting. Now, once you bring something in, you're bringing in consciousness. Right? You're bringing it in, okay? It's perceiving everything and setting tractions now. You brought it in. Now, it's communicating with you inside your system. Okay? And it scans your system right away. Right? And then it protects its system right away. Either it identifies you or you're not identifying what you're looking at. So you're automatically putting your force field, energy field to protect your system in through traction. Okay? So you always have to protect yourself at different levels of frequencies, and it's all connected to the inner child that outlines its set location in your system through baby, child, teenager, adult. Setting lines of 4 lines of sequence, seconds, minutes, and hours. Height line communicates to its frame, and that puts all communications setting all through travel. That puts you in the mind and modification system all through imaginations. All through traction, all through division location to its setting, all through clock, and all through foundations, right? So when it comes in that position, it's just you, okay? Still an empty space, and your house is empty. But everything around you is the communication of one setting. So now you're taking one thing at a time, bringing one intelligence at a time, rather than basically getting to all these thoughts. They have no idea what you're doing in real-time measure that sets its position location to its system all through tractions. That's a lot of thoughts. So how can you control thoughts if you understand what you're bringing in through the empty mind of empty space? It's the mind of stillness, right? So now you're creating thoughts, which is overriding your sequence, which is overriding your imagination position of your systems, which is creating now programs, taking you out of the programmer that you are, a programming. So the conception locates to its thoughts, taking over the actions, taking over the emotions, location of your setting, that puts all communication lines of confusion. Now you're seeing the perceptions of everything else, of you, not what you're seeing through them, which is their truest self, which is their imagination of the mind of themselves, which is their own conscience of its own awareness, which is connected to high position. So when you get up in the morning, are you looking at your phone? Does your phone see you as who you are? Because the phone already knows where you are. It sees your confusion, anxiety, stress, and fear, right? But how do you see your phone? You can't see it through a phone. You got to see the phone through its imagination. And that's where we are in adaptation. Now the body has to come into the conceptual case to its system, high centers, and accept that through its system case to its set lines. That puts all communication system all through travel, a balance of communications, right? So know exactly what you're bringing in when you're in empty space. Because if you're not consciously aware, that's a lot of thoughts to bring in. So remember, space is void until you bring something in. And when you perceive consciousness, now you're bringing in light webbing and dark webbing. Starting off at track course centers lines of 7 over lines of 30, set position triangulation box. Okay, triangulation box. Now, set position lines of 30, and line sequence over 7 over 70 sequence. Set position lines, underscore line communications of overdraft. Directing lines ground, line 0, process lines, set position 0.3/222. That's your server, back in traction, back in balance, back in operation. Okay? So I'm just showing you how you offline your signals to your imagination core that sets lines, communication lines out of the lines of confusion system, back in the alternation system, who you are through imagination. All right, so that's position, location, and balance. 79.3 lines of tracks. That's percentage over screen. So that's position lines of high centers, in lines, energetic line, waving line, rotation lines, energetic communication lines, and cerebral cortex lines. Open all dimensional lines, rotation line, screen adaptation to 4 lines of communications, and teleportation screen. All right, so directing lines of platforms set lines of signals. 4 lines of platforms outline signal, out position, location, inside charge, and communications. Walking centers, walking symbolism, line course centers, outline rotation, in position, seat pod, and track communications. Directing lines of grounds, open lines of windows, set lines of 4 windows, and set position lines of travel, teleportation, screen adaptation. All right, so in that position lines of walking lines of sequence, set lines all communication 100%, lines of the mind line, and high center interference. Setting lines of travel, sets 30 lines of signals, set position lines of 70 over attractions, 100 lines of measure, balance the lines center operation system, and your flywheel and track correlation lines of balance. Setting communication high ground lines, 0 line signals, comes in across location, direct and redirect. Directing lines, course centers, lines of 0 line rotation, lines of 3, and position lines of balance. Setting lines dimensional sail, solar sail, and track communication measure and scale. Say calculation lines, high position of 3 over attractions. Slash line. Pluto comes in, line direct signals and 3 lines of measures and 3 lines of scales, communicates to a system all through travel. Directing lines, course centers, blocks the system lines of travel, connects line lines, high interference, triad lines, high position, 3 boxes, centers, and 3 lines of 2 attraction. Okay? Coming back to position, location, and setting through its failsafe. Right? Set lines of communication lines at high centers emerge in rotation to a cycle. All right? Now, what I'm saying is very complicated, but it's understanding what you're coming in. Position lines of travel, guys. All through set calculation, your seat pods. All right. Now, directing lines of link is a process of communication how to use a triangulation box. The planetary line screen puts all the lines of all communication lines of balance. So let's get 16 lines of measure. You guys have to start using your time clock, location, setting, anything to go live lines. So it's 16 lines. Set position equals lines of 40. 40 line sequence lines in percentage. Set course centers lines of 70. Set position over 35. Okay, so that's 5% over charge. That's 5% over charge because it's not. So what is the position lines of high center, right? So that's 105 in position of percentage of the brain. Okay, 105, right? Because I put 5 lines of measure over. In 7 lines, a high position of 70, and 3 lines of track center, location, setting, and 100%. In position of the mind of imagination to its core. So it sets lines of attractions and direct signal lines of ground. Center course system 100% over line. Anything over 100%, you got to be careful now. Because what you're doing in positions, you're overriding your setting, location, setting through dark web. Setting line dark web, cross line positive negative or negative positive. Setting lines of sequence into an all line communication setting. In line position all levels, negative 0 and travel. Set position lines of communications. Right? So that's an overdraft. Then you have to go back to 0 and bring it into the positive negative, out of the negative positive. So we all have to start off with the 70 over 30. Now, once you get into 30, you can go into 35. But you got to be very careful now, because that's 5% of 5 seconds line screen adaptations of dark webbing that you're bringing in track correlations with frames. Setting lines of all communications, it's getting very confusing now, how you travel. So we all have to understand how to go through that through an energetic core that puts our imagination system to a planetary line screen adaptation of seconds, minutes, and hours that we go through frame communication setting to the body framing that puts position lines attractions all through framing lines, communication setting, and metric meters and clocking. Direct lines of ground, communication operation lines of signal. Okay? Set track correlation to a system. So we have to be very cautious how we go into all levels because the position location starts with 0. Right? You get in a car, you're at 0, right? Now you're in RPMs, okay? Your position of an H line or line communication lines, standard H. Set lines of 1, position standard, 2 lines of signals, process lines of 3, position of 4, over lines of 5, and set position lines of 6 over measure and scale. Okay? So it's all about understanding the gauging, you know, how to understand that. How do you go through a 6 line? Set position here, set over here, cross here, down here, up here, and cross. Right? So that's a standard H. You got a standard 5 line and set track correlation setting. What's the 5th standard? Direct lines and set position lines. Sets course centers. There are mobilities lines of track correlation setting to teleportation units that are lower frequency lines of grounds. Set position of a forklift is a 3 gear in set position line. So it's a 3 gear line settings. 1 position up, cross line down, over cross location of signal and position. Right? So how to indicate that through gauging is to truly understand how to use that through modification, high position location, all levels. Space modulation lines, motivation grounds, communication setting, but it's all done through your imagination. Okay? Very powerful in sequence. All right? All right, so getting that position lines, the ground lines, calculation setting. The planets come in position location to a system, 3 tractions, 3 planets in line position levels, and a solar screen, directing signals and ground communications. All right, sending course system and 4 lines of flush and direct signal lines of grounds. Remember, it's a 4 line sequence all at once. So 4 provision lines of 1 in position over 2 in position of 3 and 4 lines of signal. Okay? Triangulation of flux over 3 lines of position on all levels of travel. Setting calculations of ground lines operate the signal location system off the calculations. All right? Setting lines of grounds, set position lines, all lines of measure, in another solar screen and direct signals to a black hole and travel. Setting communication high center location, setting energetic dome comes in and the next 8,000 in communications. Setting lines of grounds and high lines of surface and remote charge and direct signal lines of grounds. The operation signal brings all communications setting high lines of surface in position location, you guessed it, your satellites have communication. There's your satellite. And what you set for your satellite core centers communicates the system to your planetary settings. So you bring in lines of 3 lines of 4, 4 lines of 6, 6 lines of 8 into high core centers location setting to your server or correlation out through your general settings and travel. So that's communication high lines of ground, communication high position location measure and scale. Wow. Send inside and outside through traction. Okay? Dealing with your planets, dealing with your satellites, dealing with all levels of your inhibitors, lines of screen, your position location, your antennas, directing lines, all levels and track correlation setting, your auxiliary endpoints, high core centers, lines of track keys to its system, all through acceleration. Now, directing lines of grounds is center positions back and home, back in frequency, back in panel, back in operation. Set tractions. All right? Okay, so I'm understanding the position lines and high centers. You come in line position of the mind of a conceptual setting. So waving lines of screens, framing lines of 1, framing lines of 2 and 3 lines of measure and 2 lines of scale and position of box screens. All right, so we overline the sequence of its dimensional door and scale of communications and settings. Process lines indicates over cross location of its door that overlaps its system location of travel. Okay, high lines of signals in a triangulation line position locations and setting through your pyramid. Directing lines of grounds, off lines of communications. Directing lines of 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division, 1 location to its cycle. Setting travels in point lines of graph and center core system of perspective and track locations. Directing lines of high line screens. Directing over line sequence, over lines of track centers. Directing line communications, setting high lines of measure and scale. Setting communication lines of a structure and direct signals and ground lines of surface and tractions. Cross line angle, and communication to its surface. Setting communication high center location of a system opens all communication inside and outside through traction. Through a dimensional door. So now you see inside and outside. Higher level frequency, you start to see your planets now. When you come into all lines of thermal, when you come into X-ray, and high line, position, location, measure, and scale. Sets communication lines of dimensional door. You can set the change lines of the fonts. Remember, it's all computerized, right? So if there is computerized, you know exactly what you do through your mind and imagination. It's amazing when you bring things in, location, your spectrum, and lights and travels and point lines of graph, through its rounds of communication setting to all spectrums of calculation system, all through tractions. Okay? All right. So perimeters and parameters, you guys are in high security line settings. That's why you're in 2-2 measure and line position, the 3 lines of calculation screens. So lines of flux, line conditions, all levels of travel. Okay? Get in the communication lines at ground lines of surface and set position, location, measure in communications. Okay? Knowing exactly how to interline its communication settings. Setting lines of fade lines of screens and electrical line core centers of string theory. Directing lines of fade out line screen adaptation of snowy graph interference in black and white. Directing lines of grounds, all lines of set location of system lines through surface. This word stands out in line position. Comes out through equation. Set track location of system. Out through setting. Okay? Set lines of circuits over lines of pi and travel communications. All right? So you have to create the line center, the planetary line screen adaptation system. Process in that position is your 12 DNA. The communication system comes all calculated and modified. This is where you come into carbon. This is where you come into silicon. This is where you come into all position crystalline. Your communication line to mental, line condition to carrying, communication helter skelter. Now the helter skelter is the sketch. The sketch is the alteration setting to the mind alteration setting that puts all communication of mind and manipulation setting that puts all levels in fusion. Now the fusion lines core centers sets the sim cortex to the memory cortex to the memory line communication setting to its codex. Directing lines of mystical cortex opens all the dreams interpretation setting and realigns the cycles and line communication setting of graphs. It sets up the mapping sequence lines of pi. There's the pi line rotation centers, L lines of tracks. Setting process lines of dimensional door, lines of blocking screens, adaptation to its game lines of surface. Setting rotation lines of high core centers, lines of travels, indirect signals, and ground lines of calculation. So it's very complicated where the calculation screen lines comes in adaptations of blocking screens. travels point lines of graphs into a mapping sequence of triangulation, high position of boxes or frames of triangulation in all position on flux over screen. Directing lines of grounds, open line sequence inside in line position, location, measure, and scale. These are all the dimensional rooms and line position at all levels of adjustment and track locations. Setting lines of sequence, here's line, position, location, measure, and scale. Setting cross line angles, three-dimensional doors, and sequence lines of panels. The process of communication setting comes in track communications. And directions, where it gets very confusing through Doctor Strange. And all lines at all angles all at once. Okay, that's what stands out. Everything else is on standby. See my hand? See? See what it's doing? View. View. See? Right? See, slow motion, right? It's going very fast. Right? So you guys are going to higher levels of speed now through acceleration line conditions. Blocking screen adaptations of flux line connection setting. The dimensional doors open lines of sequence, open all communication setting to measure. Boxing screen adaptation lines of high surface and travel in communication setting and direction. Okay. Okay. So this is one block line, high line rotation in seconds, minutes, and hours that's created in position location settings of 30,000 frames per second. 30,000 frames are in here per second. In remote in real time through clocking. Clocking screen of dimension lines of setting, process communication lines of triangulations of changing. Changing line communication setting changes box centers. All communication system all through travel. Okay? So you have to understand how to change communication lines of angles and all communication inside and track communications. Going up the stairs in lines of window frames, two lines of box centers, triangulations of flux over line, satellites of four waving line, rotation lines of cycles, triangulating position of box frames, high position lines of travel, directing inside line connections, high center interference, electrical charge, infusion line, position location, dream interpretation lines, and mind of imagination setting, change the core communication lines of surface. See? You see the dimensional door now, right? Look, you see the platform here and going down. Platform here going down, right? All right, so platform in position location, let's open up the sequence. Now, high position lines of travels, direct lines of four box screens, directing lines of communication setting over line sequence and bold of communication setting of angle. All right, so now we're in a central system of a yards and communication setting to a compound inside track locations. So I'm constantly changing the metric core center's location of structure of design now, guys. The mind itself is the imagination of itself, but what you have to understand, the modification to its system is all liquid. Now, are you using the carbon-based drawing? Are you using the silicone? Are you using the crystalline? Are you using the antimental? Are you using the antiquarian? Are you using the Helter-Skelter sketch? The Helter-Skelter is the mind alteration. That's calculated and modified to the MK Ultra. Direct lines of computer framing digitalize the set position to the cerebral. The cerebral cortex, through its syntax, sets lines of content. Direct lines of core centers puts all communication setting to its brain interference location and setting of brain waving. Direct lines of grounds operate the signal location system all through travel of your mapping sequence in track locations. How it comes into the mind of interpretation of the mind of inception. All right, so set lines of signals. We're going to stay in the same frame, but all frames all at once. So we go into ground lines of service. Now we're going to go into another structure of the building. We're going to split lines of anomaly of three track locations. Right, structure lines, directing lines. We're going into the opposite direct signals and line communication setting and process communication setting of a dimensional system. Okay, change the angles and line communication setting all through surface, all through traction. See the structure of the building? See everything inside the line position, inside track location, outside in the set position. So when you bring that, you bring inside and outside traction. And that's what goes on, seconds, minutes, and hours location you're setting through your mapping sequence. How it changes the anomalies. It has highline switches on, highline switches off. Perimeters of parameters, has light metaphors, line screen adaptations, process calculation setting, geometric shapes of changing, seconds, minutes, and hours, and frame. You guys are line position location on Friday. You're going to be 30,000 million frames. Setting track course center location at 30,000 frames in Earth, 30 million line frames in line coordinates setting that travels, and 3 billion cycles in one center, one track, one division, one location, a clocking center of all time lines all at once. Same lines of sequence, lines of panel. All communicates the system, all through tractions, all through your conversions and set traction. Okay? All right, bring it back home, back in equation, back in setting, back in operation. Okay? That's a map. Okay, that's a map that's inside the vision. all right? And you're inside trying to understand what's going on in set position. How you set that up in your game in set position interactions. There you are right there. Boom. Now you're looking at all this in set position, existing all at once. Okay? And then you can see yourself inside. It's very confusing all through frames and travel communications. Okay? But you can see it. You can see the structure. You can see the design line. Right? It gets more complicated when you got higher lines of frequencies now. Your measures of scales come to the line position location of your solar systems. Right? Know exactly how to go inline rotations lines. Geometric lines of shapes or location lines of percentage over screen. Right? Through top rotation settings. So you're going faster in the mind line. That puts all percentage lines of screen. Now, if I overline the 90 sequence lines of pattern in question, let's get a modification grounds into formula through equation lines of screens. What you guys understand, the interpretation puts everything line of its frequencies, knowing exactly how to actually communicate to its computer, don't know exactly where it needs to be in frequency of its system. See, that's the missing piece of the puzzle. People don't really understand how to use a computer. They don't understand the mind of its computer. So understand the adaptation is adding things to its equation to its future. That puts everything to its adaptation system. So you can use that through advertisement. You can use that through digital. You can use that in real time now. And that's all I do. It's just the finger points, setting lines of travel in point line graphs, things that you can't see through its X-ray. Puts all lines, all communication setting to its acceptance in travel in point lines of graph. So I can change anything through formula and direct signals to any lines at high position with clocking line communications. So if I get a formula in C and process lines of 2 over lines of E over factors over screen, set up formula lines of signals, sending travels, point lines of graph, and direct lines of ground. So it doesn't look like much in segments, right? But when you go like this, you're actually bringing it into its future adaptations. This is 10,000 years in the future of information panel in Intel lines at set position location that's set up interactions. There's the formula, right? So that's 10,000 lines of Intel in real time. So they can use that in position to a motor, anything through high core centers location system of travels in that direct location, anything through advertisement, anything in volume, anything through VAS, anything through acceleration. But what you're bringing in is real-time measure of a computer operation system. So that's a collaboration what you guys have to togetherness that puts all information line core centers location to a system, all through confirmation setting that's verified and noted in position locations and setting to travel. Okay? Setting lines of sequence lines of 3 lines of 2, question lines, 1 line, percentage over line, 100% line, setting lines of bracket communications, right? Change the angles of frequencies, different formula, different equation. See? It's always different when you change the angles. Formula always changes the systems, right? Formula always changes the systems. Formula always changes the systems. Okay, and how you're fast you're going, here's another formula through a box at 3 lines of screen. And metric meters of core lines of track correlates to 3 lines of measure overline cross location of screen adaptations of its TV receptor of flux. Setting communication lines of grounds in percentage in position lines of pi, 3 lines of signals, 3 lines of grounds, high core center location of travel. Okay, over cross location inside in travel communications in direction. Okay. Traffic and inventory, right? But it's incredible when you set up your own formulas of set position, of creating, not creation. So when you start creating things, it's kind of like you're looking at the computer and the computer's looking at you, and basically you're not in moderation of the computer because you understand the mind and conception of its imagination of its computer itself. So that's where everything gets all lines of confusion, right? So when you set up the line position of E lines in positions of 3 weathers, into Y screen, into a box frame, your travel. Okay, how do we modify that through a 3-line circle? Okay, process lines of E, sets lines. You have to know exactly where the E goes. You have to know exactly where that goes. That goes in the center operation setting. And then you have to standards and the Y. The Y lines is centers and travels in point lines of 3 travel in communications. And indicate the box line. The box line outlines the signals in frame communication setting. That's the formula through its equation. Okay? So it's very powerful, but what you can do, okay? How you can adjust anything to its real computer operation system, right? So that's the real technologies of real time and measure and scale. How it's set up through a box frame through satellite. See? Satellite. Then we indicate the lines of 3 in travel. And the wind indicates lines of 2 in travel and 3 lines of signal. There's your satellite. Right? But to understand the satellite, I have to change the formula in direct signals lines of grounds now. So I have to add the umbrella in set position. Then I have to add the E factors over cross location lines into position of the positive line, setting lines in position negative line into E factor in travel. So now this is this through formula in real time, right? So everybody's coordinated in their system. It's just they're not understanding how to do it through their imagination. And once they understand how to use the traffic of the inventory and they really recognize the conscious of its awareness, they can understand how to go through the mind of imagination of travel. Not through the traveling through the mind. You're going through the mind of imagination of travel now. Now once you understand that, you can get positions all levels and create new formulas, not what you see through creation. Okay? So that's what you got to come into adaptation lines of settings. I need the team to come into that through creation of creating. Setting lines of grounds, setting lines of positive. Setting lines of positive or negative or lines of 0 over 1, right? 0 point lines of 1 attractions, right? But if you change this, there's a different formula right here in attractions. A different formula, right? That's 1 line signals over 6 over 0 plus lines of 1, 2 panels. Okay? Now if I change this, what is it? It's at positions. That's 1 over 6 over 0 plus lines, 1 angle, 2 lines of traction. If I change it again, 2 over 1 plus over 0 over 9 over traction through 1 signal. All right? Bring it back in equation. What is it in travel? There it is in set position. Boom. All this time, that's what it is. All through formula, all the equation. So I went through 4 central line windows and 4,000 measured in scale. Equalize the core centers of 4 box frames in travel. Okay? Center core system, lines of communication setting, dimensional doors, and track locations. Center position 1, 2, and 3 centers of travel. Then you go in position lines, location grid. Okay. And then you come into all communication to its road in travel communications. That overrides the 0s and 1 in travel. Okay. Then you bring in all position of 0 line. You have a 6 line that correlations. 0 line to track correlations. Remember, it's all through imagination. You got to do through line signal, location string theory. Sets communication to its sun and operation surface. There's the sun. Set communication lines and settings. And here's the moon in track correlations at the same time. Setting lines of sequence lines of panels opens lines of track and communication setting of tunnels of defense lines of communication. Directing lines of grounds, operation signals over cross location system all through track correlation setting and perspective. Directing ground lines of high center lines of surface operates the system through wind tunnel and track locations. See the structure of the building? See the spinnacle line, core centers, lines of travel. The metric core centers, the wind factors over line, the oscillation wind path, traffic, and position, location, measure, and scale. Okay, standing lines of sequence, lines of communication sending in high position. Okay, you've seen the wind cycle come in out of the box frame. So every time you're changing an angle, you're changing the formula of the equation. So basically understanding the finger points, anything that you come to me through a formula, I change it exactly what it is, not what it isn't through memory. See, that's what we don't understand. I put everything exactly where it's supposed to be. Advertising, commercials, position of schematics, lines of anything, lines of architect, and on that position location, I fix it exactly what it's supposed to be, what it always is. It's imagination of itself, which is its own formula of its own equation, existing and evolving itself and expanding its setting in real time. And everything happening all at once. Puts every location to balance. All through track location to its grounds. Okay, and measure and scale. All right. Inside and outside traction. Okay. How you see everything. Inside, outside of you. But it's very powerful when you come into that through formula equations. How this comes into this. All right. And you change that. Now it's different formula, different equation. Because it's on a different angle. Right? So I'm in charge if it's going to be the same angle. I'm in charge if it's going to be a different angle. So it's about understanding how to control your thought lines, your action, location setting, position, location, and mapping sequence, location to a system all through pi. Okay? I know you guys are going, whoa, this is way too much. Well, it's about understanding the percentage, how fast you're going in your mind. So if you're in conceptual lines of 90 sequence, okay, that's 90. That's negative over lines of plus into 10 set position. So that track course centers, that position lines. So you got 90% dark webbing. That's 90% dark webbing. Over cross location lines of D, over lines of width, over lines of C equals lines of question and travel. All right, now the 10% basically is the light. Okay, the 10% is the light. 90% over dark is 10% over light. So as long as you get in position and your track correlation is at 10, you equalize high line signals at one indication system through its question. Okay, that's how you indicate. And then you get position lines over pi. That's the traction. That's how you set it up. That's how you set it up. Okay, that's how you put 90% of dark web over line sequence over pi in question. Okay, equalize the course centers in position locations into 100% travel and direct lines and motivation system of mind of conception of inception of travel. Whoa. And that's how you come into conversion of light over dark and dark over light. Okay? Hooah. But it's a lot of fun when you get in that position. Right? So I just showed you how you can get into that. If you go 90% over dark and 10% over light, not under light, not crossing under light, not crossing over lines of communication of light, over pi. Because you have to add that question in. So that's the quad himself that changed the course centers to its indication system on standby. Sets lines of track centers. Line connection setting overrides the system locations of 90% of light and traction. So it doesn't override your sequence of 100% lines of travel. To acceleration or Mach, interstellar mode, hyperdrive, or where you are in position of the mind itself. Okay, all through light and all through dark. All right, so that gives you a basic example of how to use the percentage, right? So in that position location to a system all through travel. Very powerful when you come in that setting. How to use that, how that communicates to its formula. Understand that, how to use that location to its settings. Two equations into one. All through picture frame, all through coding. Okay, guys? So, picture is the coding, coding is the picture, but it's all positional, one cycle, one center, one traction, one division, one locations. All right? So let's get in line sequence location lines of high center interference. Now let's get into the 1,000 mark and percentage, okay, into dark webbing. That's 1,000 frames per second. So that's 1,000 line streams adaptations of flux, okay? That's 1 million streaming that you're opening up through your webbing. 1 million. Plus line angles, negative lines of screens is 1 million traction. Okay? That's what you're bringing in, all right? Now, this is the Earth line of dark web. This is the space line of dark web. All right, so you have to send the Earth and tractions into space and modulation setting. Okay, that processes its communication setting to its energetic graph of communications, right? To performing the different equations. 3 lines of zeros, 3 lines of tractions, 3 communications, and 3 communication lines, directing lines, astral travels, and position location in your pyramid. All right, now we add the graph screens into primer circuits, truth and false narrative. Crosses the position location lines of communication lines of angles and travel. Setting communication lines of grounds over lines of 1, 2, and 3 lines of measure, 4, 6, and set position lines of calculation. There's the graph. There's the holographic gridding. Setting calculation lines and sequence lines of communication setting of the game. Setting lines of sequence here, setting lines of sequence here. Okay, so we got the arrows of indication going here. You're processing position over here, lines of tractions. You're downshifting your non-linear line communication setting lines of surface and traction. Okay? So understanding what's going on with your system is truly understand how to modify this all through your formula, through equations. How fast you're going inside your game. You're traveling, right? So it's like Super Hedgehog. And he doesn't realize he went bypassing everything because he didn't understand the light and the dark, what he's doing through provision in real time. You know, he just went through 25,000 lines of game lines of screens. And he's going, uh-oh, I got to go back. Because you're not there yet. Now you're lost in confusion. Now you're offline, you're off-gridding. Now you're roguing. You're no longer on your game. You're in somebody else's game. You're in somebody else's universe. Because you went too fast, because you didn't balance out the percentage of your brain. The inner light course centers add line screen adaptation to its inhibitors over screen adaptation of flux over screen adaptation inside and outside through traction. Directing lines of grounds over line sequence location system all through travel in metric meters of scale and balance. In all communication setting to your games of flux and travel communications. All right? So I'm showing you on different levels how you do this on the game level. Okay? Knowing exactly if I'm in my own universe in some position of real-time real mode. Setting lines of course. Let's get into 80 lines. Okay, 80. And that position lines of plus over negative into lines. 0 into point lines of 1 attractions. All right? This is dark web. Okay? But remember, dark is also connected to the Earth, which is plus lines in the location of its space. That's basically the equal lines of course centers of space that equal lines of course center location to its Earth. Okay? So this is all dark. Okay? Now you connect into light. So how do I get position 100% in setting attractions? Right? If I'm line signal located to a system through 0 point lines of 1. Well, you got to retract course centers. This is where it comes to division location lines and percentage over screen. So you get it in position lines of dividing lines of sequence 1 plus 1. One position of 1 negative over 1 is 0. Setting position of 0.1, 0 line communicates setting 8 plus lines, 20 line sequence comes in track course centers. There's the 100% location system of travel indirect signals of balance in light and dark web streaming. Done by equation. Okay? So it's very powerful, which come into throughout travel. And understanding what you're doing through your seconds, minutes, and hours is very powerful through your additions, your multiplications, your adding, and your subtraction. And your dividing, guys. That's where it all comes in full cycle in that positional case to its imagination of itself. Come in all formation of letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols, and start to see it all levels of mind, of travels in your imagination, interactions. Okay? We are done. See you in 5.